Cool. I want to welcome everyone to the second webinar of data literacy for the series for 2019. And we're recording this live right now, so we will be publishing this to the web. So, this webinar is all about a process that I would like to put out there. And really, the intention, as we'll talk about, is for people who are really new to working with data. A lot of times when you start out doing something, the initial steps can be very mechanical, and you need to be very purposeful about walking through the process step by step. And then eventually, as you become more and more familiar with the process, that becomes more natural, and you sort of the trappings of the frameworks tend to sort of dissolve away because you are more familiar now with what to do and what not to do. And so I believe that this is a great framework to get started, and I want to walk through that with you all today. So let me start by sharing my screen. And, what I wanted to do was kind of ask myself, what types of frameworks have I noticed before, instead of just starting from a blank canvas? And let me know if you can all see my screen. Just by the way, you can see in the chat that there's a way to just leave comments or ask questions. Feel free to do that as we go along. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat window there. And so if you have any comments, great. Thank you, Vanessa, for letting me know. And yeah, definitely let me know if there are any questions or comments that pop up. And I want to make this a discussion. This isn't really just about me lecturing to you all. I think different people have different points of view about frameworks, and I want to make sure we have that discussion. So session number 2, this is what we're going to call the Wisdom Data Working Flow. And but before we dive into it, I want to talk about some other ones that I've seen out there. By the way, this is all about helping people learn the language of data. That's what this webinar series is about. We're doing it every 2 weeks and picking a set of topics for every 2 weeks to go through it. And so welcome you to continue joining and letting others know as well. We're going to publish the recording to YouTube, so look for that link to come out on social as well as in your email inbox for those of you who joined. So insight frameworks is what I thought about. There are so many of them, and let's just take a quick little review of them. So one of them is this Deming PDCA cycle. So it starts with plan, do, check, and then act. And this actually can be traced back to the Tokyo Institute of Technology in the late 1950s. And the goal was always to help people continuously improve business and often manufacturing processes. It really was embraced by the quality community, those who are into quality control, quality engineering, improving output, and reducing scrap, things of that nature. So that's the PDCA cycle. And it's a circle, right? Notice it's a loop, so it's continuous. You kind of go through this process over and over again. And the steps are really all about going through sort of a series of actions where you plan your next step to make some improvements. You make some changes. You check the impact. You see what happened, and then you kind of act accordingly by making further adjustments. So I like it. I mean, I never really, and I know a lot of people that are fervent believers in using the cycle on a continuous basis. The words never really made sense to me. I mean, not to knock it. I think obviously this has had amazing uptake and people love it, but I never really kind of, for some reason or another, never really fully jived with the words and kind of the order that they go in. But maybe that's just me. I think it's obviously a hugely valuable cycle that many, many people follow in the quality world to, save a lot of money in waste and scrap, part of Lean and part of Six Sigma. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Anybody here familiar with that PDCA cycle or use it in the past? Anybody a big believer in it and or, know someone that follows that religiously? It tends to have sort of a, zealot sort of followers. And so highly respect that. Okay, yeah, so if some folks online here haven't heard of it. PDCA, yeah, check it out. I mean, like I said, it's one of probably the most popular ones. It's so simple. So Lori's letting us know here that it was originally developed by Walter Schuhart, who was an individual that also played a huge role in quality control as it relates to control charts and things of that nature. So it really brought the kind of popular sort of acceptance, at least within Western business, by Deming a little bit later on. Okay, great. So that's one of them. Let's keep walking along here. So this is the DIKW Pyramid. This is one that many of you are familiar with. I think that technically the usage of this goes back farther than 1974. But the first trace of it, at least in this exact form, was from a 1974 journal article in the Public Administration Review by an educator named Nicholas L. Henry. And his article is called Knowledge Management, a New Concern for Public Administration. And notice what he does here, right, is this pyramid sort of takes us from a world where, there is data, but then, can you extract information out of that data? Can you then go up another level of the hierarchy and then, extract knowledge from that information that you've noticed? And then lastly, at the very top of the pyramid is this notion of, of wisdom, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. So DIKW Pyramid, this is a very popular one and tends to sort of kind of really make clear the relationship of the individual or the team and that product that they're working with, right? This data that gets then transformed step by step. This is a real popular one. A lot of people know about this one. CRISP DM. I have my friend Jeff Schaefer to thank for bringing this one to my attention not long ago. The cross-industry standard process for data mining. So this came out of late 90s, where a handful of 5 companies and they sort of kind of formed a project team under the EU, and it was funded, and they first released a version of this methodology in 1999. And so this one really then kind of takes a new step, because what it does is it's focusing on the steps of specifically working with data. Notice it includes things like data preparation and modeling and evaluation. So again, this whole process revolves around the data and how that kind of produces business understanding and how that relates to your understanding of both the data as well as the business. This is kind of a duality that's so important in our framework right now as we kind of work with data day in and day out in business, is that some people really understand the business and what's happening. Other people really understand the nuts and bolts and the inner workings of the data. And so there needs to be that kind of back and forth between those two sides of the same coin, if you will. What I love about this one is it seems to kind of make a happy face. You know what I mean? I mean, come on, you have to love that. Data's the nose right there in the middle. You got a nice big smiley face right there. But this is a good one. I mean, it's really helpful. It kind of takes those other processes we've looked at, okay, and it sort of like adds in this next level of detail about specifically what needs to be done in the world of data working, if you will. There's a link there. Okay, lastly, this one is one I spent a lot of time thinking about and training people on, this DMAIC methodology. And this is a project phase gate approach that the Six Sigma world really kind of brought to popular parlance within the last 10 or 20 years. It's been about that, I suppose. But a lot of people know about DMAIC, green belts and black belts, and Six Sigma and Lean Sigma have kind of carried through projects through these 5 phases where they define a business problem. They measure, the ability to measure. At that point, you're kind of looking at things like, what's your data collection plan? What's the reliability of the measurement system you're using to collect data? Okay, then you conduct some analysis on the data and the experiments you've carried out. But then ultimately, again, last 2 phases, this is a project methodology to improve business processes, right? Because then you make the improvements and then you seek to kind of control the outcome and sustain the gains, oftentimes are the words used in the control phase. You've got a dashboard in place, you've got metrics in place, you've got training of employees in place. And all of that is around making sure that you continuously take a process, whether it's in the shop floor or the boardroom, it could be back end, front end, it could be any type of business process, and make improvements on it. That's the DMAIC methodology. Again, really specific to improving business processes. Similar in that sense to PDCA. I think a lot of people in the quality world use those maybe back and forth interchangeably. But it occurred to me, all of these ultimately in some way link back to the scientific method. They're not exactly the scientific method. This is really based on the approach of asking a specific question and then going through a process of determining if your hypothesis is correct or not. And then, and then looping back into maybe a secondary question. So this is this general process of science in which we seek to understand the world around us, in which we seek to, collect data to understand whether our hypothesis is correct or not. But it doesn't really address, I would say, the specific data working tools and techniques that we need to use in today's world to be able to analyze data. It really, if you notice in the middle, goes from collect data to the very next question is, does it reject the hypothesis? And so in between those 2 steps, collect data and answering the question, that you had originally, as you all know, there's a whole lot of work that goes into, in many cases, preparing that data, analyzing it, and looking at it from a statistical and as well as a pragmatic or practical point of view, and coming to some conclusions. So this is a beautiful process. It's followed, and we learned this in school growing up, right? And again, I think a lot of these other methodologies and techniques would harken back to, in some way, connect back to or link to the scientific method. Super valuable. But again, not really addressing what I would call, the more fluid or, sometimes even messy approach of diving into data and working with it, where, it might not be based on a specific question, or we might start with a certain question, and then we might actually meander to a different one that's in some ways more valuable or more interesting, but that we just didn't have at the beginning because, well, we weren't in the data. We've all been down that path before. So the scientific method, again, one that we want to kind of continue to take a look at and understand. How does our process or methodology frameworks we create, how does it compare to this, to me, like the gold standard? So this is one that I've developed and I'm working on a little bit closely, which actually takes a little more of time to think about the data working processes, how you actually collect and store data, how we prepare it, structure it, combine it, join it, okay? And then the discovery phase, we use things like data visualization and analysis and statistics to make comparisons, okay? And then ultimately, oftentimes we end up sharing, where we're actually crafting a message, delivering that, listening to the feedback. And notice how, in this sense, this general notion that we've all kind of, come to be aware of, is that in some ways, each of these steps are connected, and it's not a linear flow. It isn't that you go from one to the next in rigid form, but it's very fluid. You can bounce back and forth. Sometimes you end up migrating back to an earlier step, again, because you found a better path. So this is one that I'm throwing out there and will continue to develop. But all of these, you notice that most of these have sort of a round, sort of circular shape to them, don't they? There's sort of this notion of like, it's a cycle. So you start in one phase, you kind of go around, maybe you bounce around, but ultimately, you kind of end up where you started from. So I got to thinking about this a little bit, and asking myself, how would I develop a flow that addresses this reality that we end up migrating within a process, that we don't end up following a rigid series of phases like DMAIC, that it isn't just about always necessarily improving a business process. I mean, that could be a huge part of it, but oftentimes we're just looking for interesting information for gathering insight, for making a specific decision. Say it isn't a process. It could just be a one-time decision. Or even, heaven forbid, we're just interested in entertainment value or enjoyment value of a data. It's just curiosity factor, right? There may not be a specific business process that gets addressed. And then also, this notion that things are going to loop and I keep going back to where I started from. I get that, but it also sort of didn't really sit well with me. So I thought to myself, this is kind of the first draft of what I came up with. Again, a flow, right? A circle, you go around it. So these are the same 4 steps. So WSDM, that's how I initially branded it. And then, it kind of, how you make something, right? Okay, you have your idea about it, you see it a certain way, and then you throw it out there. It's sort of, I would say maybe the rubbers hit the road and it hits reality. So this is what happened to me when I put it out there. A good friend of mine, Chris Love over there in the UK, said, hey, 50 Shades of Data, I'm into WSDM. And, poor naive me, I'm such a simple, pure person. I sat there for a while looking at this tweet. I just couldn't get it. I didn't know what he was talking about. And I thought to myself, I mean, I know the movie, but I don't get it. And then someone piped in and said, Ben, he said, hey, I did a double take for the same reason. And then I said, I see what they're talking about here. No, this is not that kind of webinar. Sorry, it isn't. But anyway, this is not a Chevy Nova type of experience. I want to make sure this makes sense. So I thought to myself, well, let's just embrace the full flow of wisdom. Get us out of any confusion about BDSM, okay? Like that, again, it's not what this is about. You got to be able to laugh about it, though, a little bit, right? I'm really glad, and I'm sure Chris is glad he has a friend like me who doesn't take things too seriously all the time, but has fun with it. So, yes, this is not about that type of activity whatsoever. It's about wisdom. So I'll put the I and the O in there to eliminate any potential for confusion. It's wisdom. Inputs and outputs, I-O, they're in there. They always work. But what is wisdom all about? Well, it's the ability, according to Merriam-Webster, to discern inner qualities and relationships, right? This word we use a lot, insight. But oftentimes it's about sensing judgment. What are we going to decide? How are we going to, make a call and go one way versus another? And how are we going to go about that in a way that incorporates insight about the direction we want to take? It can also be a generally accepted belief. So, I guess in that sense, it can connect back to science, that we come to a place where there are, notions about our universe that are accepted, and then therefore in the common wisdom, or, the accepted set of beliefs that most people have. And that, again, then the scientific learning piece of it there in 1D. But I love this second definition, which is a wise attitude, belief, or course of action. Okay, so in other words, we're going to take a course of action here when we go through this process. And so therefore, because working with data ultimately results in a course of action that's beneficial to us, as well as a variety of stakeholders, employees of the company we work at, its customers and clients. In that sense, you can say that people who are really good at working with data, who are highly data literate, who take it from its raw state into an idea about where to go now, those people inject wisdom into our businesses, and that therefore they're highly valuable. So wisdom, that's kind of the process. And I thought to myself, next thing I really asked myself was, well, how can I get out of this idea of a loop that ends? Because that almost feels like chasing your tail, or, I want to go somewhere, right? I want to actually progress somewhere. So then I kind of wanted to, with the help of my designer, Kelsey O'Donnell, who's amazing, so I worked on this idea that it's really a staircase, right? So we're kind of going up these steps of a process where we sort of start with some curiosity. I wonder something about the world, right? Then I seek out that information, right? Go through the process of discovering it. And then as a result of that, I mature in some way. Maybe I present this to other people who allow me to see it in even new light. Or maybe I take a course of action or make a decision that takes me down a path that allows for even more learning. And so then, in that sense, this process just kind of keeps going up. And I love that idea and that visual, because many of you who know me know that I'm a really avid hiker and backpacker here in the Seattle area. These are my two boys here, Aaron and Simon. And we were on a trail to a place called Twin Falls here just outside of Seattle, along the 90 corridor, maybe about half an hour outside of the city. But this is kind of something we find ourselves on, these trails and these paths, going up these stairwells, sometimes that are, very kind of craftily sort of built into the trail, when you've got, in this case, as you can see, maybe some erosion happening there, maybe the need to preserve the trail. These crews work these trails year in and year out and just make sure they're in good shape for us. But oftentimes that's what we're doing, right? We're stepping up and up and up. Going to I love that idea that what we're doing is we're on a journey to a higher place. And that, the experience itself, step by step, is valuable. And also there's rewards when we get there. And so that really jived well with me. And in that sense, then, wisdom, WSDM, it isn't like you go through 4 steps and you're done and you stop. It's more like this sort of a thing where you just continually are going up and up and taking different pathways of increasing, wisdom gathering, and taking these inputs, converting them into outputs that take you up and up and up. Okay, that's the idea there, and why I like the idea of a stair-step approach to thinking about the process. But then, really critically, these are steps. And so the question is, who are they for? What scenario would you find a person who would make good use of these steps? And so I thought about that, and so, well, maybe what I want to do is kind of go into more depth about this flow in each one of these 4 steps. How can we flow through a very in-depth process? And so, we kind of take the flowchart mentality, and I've kind of been going flowchart crazy. So I need to remind myself, does everything need a flowchart? Arrow? No. But this one seemed to be helpful for me. And so why would it be helpful, though, to kind of literally take this messy, iterative, loop back, creative process and create in some rigid flow? Why would I do that? Well, I think that it's valuable for new learners. And it made me think about my son, Simon. Here he is right here. And we've been snowboarding a lot together. Now, last year, if anybody's ever snowboarded, you know that you kind of go down the slope, right? And there's really one of two, since your feet are sideways on the board, there's one of two ways that you typically tend to navigate your way down the slope. One is that you're on your heel edge. So your toes are up and you're digging your heels in. And then the board is riding an edge on your heel. And then you transition to being on what we call the toe edge, where your toes, your heels are up off the ground. The other edge of the board is kind of digging into the snow and the slopes, and you kind of make your way to the other way. And then, you S-shape all the way down. Well, last year, my little guy, Simon, he's 13, wonderful boy. he was out there on the slopes getting real frustrated. I kind of was trying to figure out what was going wrong. And so I was taking up skiing. So he was ready to give up. So I left my skis at home and I put a snowboard on. And he and I hit the slopes together. And I realized what was happening was he was going heel edge and then he would fall down. Then he'd stand up and he'd go heel edge and he'd fall down. And he'd stand up and he'd go heel edge. So he would never go on his toe edge. And he said, Dad, I just don't know how to go on my toe edge. Okay, got it. I can see why that would make it really hard to S-shape your way down the slope, right? So I said to Simon, okay, I'm going to go down this one place. I just want you to come over to that area and just sit down next to me. Now I'm going to go over here, right? Now I'm over here. Simon, I want you to go on your toe edge to me and just sit down when you get there. That's it. Just your only job is to come to me and sit down. Got it. He did that. And then we said, okay, next time, now I want you to go to me, but instead of sitting down, I want you to try to turn to the other edge and then sit down, which he did. So in any case, I'll tell you, once we went through it a few times, he got it. It was really amazing to see that, but originally he had to really pay attention to all the mechanics, every little step, every tiny transition, be really deliberate about doing all that. And once he did that a few times, it became really fluid to the point where on Monday, this second season he's out there, we went out, he had a day off school, so I took him to the slopes and I couldn't keep up with him. I see him go flying by me. And that was kind of a nice feeling. But I'll tell you, he wasn't thinking about toe edge, heel edge, and sitting down. And no, it was just more natural at that point. And so, this is true of so many things in life that we learn that, those initial phases, very deliberate, very purposeful about going step by step. And that is why I think this flow chart is going to be helpful to the new person finding their way into working with data for the first time. It's really helpful for them to have a framework to think about and look at and refer back to and ask themselves, where am I? What step of the process? What am I doing here? Right? What am I not doing here? What do I need to watch out for? And then eventually, yes, those things tend to fall away and it becomes more this like wu-wei concept of doing, not doing, where the dancer becomes the dance. It isn't that I need to think about this flow chart anymore. I'm just in the middle of it and it's a very natural thing for me. So here we go. Let's step into it. It's kind of, I got some advice from some good friends of mine saying, just whatever you do, don't show the whole thing all at once. Okay, so we'll step into it slowly. We're going to go step by step. And hopefully this makes sense to everyone. So to me, it starts with this observation. Okay, so we're going to observe something about the world, our environment, our business climate, whatever. It doesn't have to always be about business. It could be about your own personal health or finance. It could just be some general area of curiosity, as we'll talk about in a minute. But you're observing something. You see something and you take note of it, all right? So I love this quote by Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote the book Their Eyes Were Watching God, as well as a number of other amazing books, but late 19th and early 20th century. But she talks about this, right? So think about it in terms of research. You're doing research. That kind of sounds boring dry, but no, it's not. What it is it is formalized curiosity, poking and prying with a purpose. It is a seeking that he who wishes may know the cosmic secrets of the world and they that dwell therein. So that's such a beautiful thing, right? That this whole process starts with curiosity. And I think that that's really important for people who traditionally have been data phobic, afraid of using data, because they think to themselves, there's this other thing I know how to do, and it isn't my experience or intuition anymore, that somehow I have to abandon those things and move over here to using data and tools and software products and handling file formats and database conventions and things. And that's a foreign world to them. And they think, well, I don't want to let go of this instinct and experience that I have. I really want to hang on to that and trust that. And my message is you actually need it. In fact, it starts with that. It starts with this human process of saying to yourself, I wonder what's going on. All right, so that's a really important thing to take away, is that the human intuitive spark is the spark plug of this engine of analytics, that without it, there's nowhere to go. What's valuable? What's interesting? What does your curiosity tell you about what's a thing that would be valuable to look at? Or once you get down a certain pathway, there's going to be something inside you that's a spark that tells you to go do something else. And that's okay. It's good to listen to that. So starting with an observation about the world. All right. And then you kind of go down this next few steps where you not only do you observe something, you're going to ask a question. You're going to say, I wonder about this. And here's my question. And that could be anything. That could be, I wonder which products are more profitable. I wonder if sales are trending up or down. in the southeast region. I wonder, if there are more 3-pointers in a basketball game now than there were when I grew up as a kid. Those are things you kind of like. I think that that's true, but I wonder. And I have a question. And then this is an important next step that oftentimes I think gets skipped. But we sort of need to then go say, well, what do you think? What do you expect? Or what's your guess? And actually write that down. Even if you just jot it down, it's okay. Even if maybe you just think it through, but say to yourself, what is my guess? My guess is sales are trending up in the southeast region. Okay. Why? It's the sense I have. I haven't seen the numbers yet, but that's what I think is going to happen. And then you need to say it in a way that's falsifiable. So this individual right here, Sir Karl Popper, if you're not familiar with him, I recommend you check out his works. He was a philosopher of science of the 20th century. Some think the preeminent philosopher of science in his day. But he stated that statements or systems of statements, in order to be ranked as scientific, must be capable of conflicting with possible or conceivable observations. In other words, you need to be able to make your guess in words that could be shown to be wrong. And that sounds like, well, couldn't I show anything to be wrong? No, not necessarily. Oftentimes we word things in ways that actually aren't possible to prove wrong. And that's a whole different discussion, but it really gets into the idea of basic statements versus universal statements. Basic statements relate to something very specific, like that swan over there is white. That's a basic statement. A universal statement would be, all swans are white. And so that's actually a falsifiable statement, right? And in fact, not only is it falsifiable, it was shown to be false because what happened? Well, in the 1700s, 1697 or 17th century, a Dutch explorer in Australia came across a black swan. Well, the statement all swans are white was in that moment shown to be false. Okay, so that is a universal statement that was worded in a way to be falsifiable. And that's a detail that I really harp on because I think a lot of times we get down the road of, what do I see the problem? Well, maybe I haven't articulated clearly. What is the problem? Oftentimes I see people inferring more from their data than perhaps is reasonable. As an example, they might say, instead of saying, the customers who responded to my survey happen to prefer product B over product A. They say, well, our customers like product B better. As if every possible customer replied to the survey, as if that's going to be carrying forward in perpetuity, as if, we get into this idea that the data we have extends beyond what it's telling us specifically. So then once we have this question and this hypothesis, obviously the next question is, hey, do we have data about this or not? And sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And sometimes if you don't, well, then what's the next step, right? If you don't have data, you need to go either find it and gather it, or you have to create yourself. And oftentimes I love this story of, for example, Florence Nightingale, who went about capturing the mortality statistics in these field hospitals during the Crimean War. Or also Dr. John Snow, who went around door to door and collected cholera death information in a certain neighborhood of London. And so, in that sense, there was no open data portal. You could go click a button and download it. They had to create their own data, and they saw that as their job. They saw that as part of the scope of their responsibility as caregivers to generate the data they needed to make their case. So are we resourceful in that sense, going out and even if we need to start implementing the data collection processes, or, hopefully, and even better, making use of the data that's already there. All right, if you do have relevant data, I love this next step, which to me it's all about, and this is a quote, I talked a little bit about this in our first webinar, but a good friend of mine, Michael Mixon, he's on Twitter at MixPix, and so he's into photography as well as data, but he said this phrase a few years back in a conversation, and it stuck with me, this idea that it's really helpful to explore the contours of your data. And I love that idea because it gives me this idea of like walking around a building and looking at the extent and the boundary of it. And it compared to me to this notion of kind of, when Europeans discovered New Zealand, there were two individuals, right? The first one, Abel Tasman, in 1642, was the first European to actually discover New Zealand. There were already Maori people there at the time, but that was sort of the first time any European bumped into the island, if you will, and see the area between the two islands. Again, we talked about this last week, so I won't belabor it, but he didn't think it went all the way through. He thought it was called a bight. In other words, just like a contour in the shoreline there. And so he thought the whole thing was one island. And then about 100 years later, a little more than that, James Cook, the famous discoverer and navigator, came across New Zealand as well. And now he circumnavigated the whole thing. He went around it, all the way around. And then he noticed that that area between those two islands is actually a strait. In other words, there's a navigable water passage between two very different, distinct islands. And so then this idea of being very thorough about looking at the contours of your data, to me, is a lesson I draw from this example, because that area between the islands is no longer called Zeehane's Bight, as Tasman called it. His ship was called the Zeehane. That was the name of the ship that he was sailing. It's called Cook Strait for James Cook. So, this idea of being very thorough and purposeful about going around the contours of your data. What does that mean, though? Well, you look at the boundaries, the maxes and mins. If you have time in your data, what's the first record? When's the last one? If you have countries that are in there, how many are there? Does the number of countries go up or down over time? If you're looking at a specific metric, what's the maximum? What's the minimum? And just kind of seeing that kind of that max and min, kind of being able to say to yourself, there's a set of data I have in my hands right now, but it doesn't talk about everything forever, right? It's limited in some ways. And so a key question is, how is the data limited? And then exploring the contours, that's a way to do that. And we do that before we start doing analysis of the data. That's really critical, because otherwise you start to draw conclusions that maybe go beyond what the extent of the data is telling you and is actually giving you information about, right? So in that sense, exploring the contours is such an important step there. I love this next step, because notice what happens at this point. Oftentimes, when we explore the contours, you see that little line that got drawn at the top there? Sometimes you go, you know what, I just noticed something based on even just a quick cursory check of the contours and the shape of the data. Maybe I noticed a crazy outlier that I didn't expect to find there. Or maybe there's something happening in the data that, like, there's a block, there's a time where the data gets cut off, something like that. And you say, well, hold on, actually, I have a different question now. And in some ways, maybe it's even more interesting or compelling than the first question you had in the first place. And this is where we get, rightfully so, dislodged from our initial course of action. And here's how I think this flowchart deviates from the scientific method. Because the scientific method kind of requires you almost to go all the way down and answer that question. But sometimes in the flow of working with data, you abandon the first question. It becomes meaningless to you. You're not even interested in it anymore because of something you saw in a cursory look into the data. And that's okay, right? If you're truly intuiting that the next question is actually more valuable than your original one, then cut bait on the first one. Let it go. Move on to the bigger and better thing that you've now thought about and that you need to dive into, right? So I love this quote by Jonas Salk, who is known as one of the individuals who came up with the very first polio vaccine, again in the 20th century. Intuition will tell the thinking mind where to look next. So there's no way for me to tell you whether your question, the next one, is more relevant or interesting or important or not. That's up to you and your own intuition about your environment. And I think, again, that's a super important message for people who are new to being hands-on with data, because they need to bring to the table that familiarity they have with this with their world, with their environment. Okay, that's hugely valuable and needs to be honored in this whole flow and in this whole process. Okay, and so in that sense, that experience they have is not discarded and replaced with some data analytics framework where the data tells them something, right? No, they're bringing the spark plug again. The oil might be the data. We've heard that before, right? Data is the new oil. Great, I love it, sure. But the spark plug is your mind, and that's human nature. That's the value that humans bring to this process. Can't say it enough. So then if you continue down the road here of exploring the contours and shape, I think it's important to stop in a moment and ask yourself, what are the shortcomings here, potential shortcomings of this data? An example of that would be, if I'm looking at, for example, earthquake data, I'm not looking at the earthquakes, the number of earthquakes. That's not something that I can say. All I can say is, well, how many recorded earthquakes have there been, right? And then that sense, that has changed over time. There was a lot of investment in seismology throughout the 20th century, and our ability to detect earthquakes got better and better and better year after year. And so I'm not looking strictly speaking at the number of historical earthquakes. I'm looking at the number of historical earthquakes which were detected and recorded and preserved in the data set over time. So ask yourself about that. Once you see the contours and the shape, even maybe make a little list. What are the caveats? Because data is not a panacea, and it has plenty of issues with it. Every data set does, not just some. Every single data set has a gap between data and reality, as we've talked about in previous webinar. And we need to really kind of come to grips with what that is. But even then, that's not, I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because there's caveats, just because there's issues, there's still a value in going forward into the analysis. But hopefully we have the data in a form that's ready for analysis. But so often we don't, right? So you get to this place where it's like, well, I'm looking at the data, I looked at it, and I realized to myself, there are a lot of issues with this data. Maybe I need to change the date format. Maybe it's in a format that's not kind of conducive to the type of analysis I want to do. Maybe I need to bring in other data sets and merge them together. Like, perhaps it doesn't have population. It's only looking at a specific metric about a country or a city. And I need to match that up with population in order to be able to understand my original question, which was more about a rate than it was about an absolute value. Do you know what I mean? So this is this important step of data munging, data wrangling. It's so important. Some people make a whole career out of it, and this is a specialty or a discipline they spend a lot of time with. The rest of us need to know how to dabble with it, or at least be able to understand the types of issues we come across with data that we need to then make some adjustments and get us into the step where we can go to the next step, which is actually analyzing it. What are we doing here? We're saying to ourselves, can I listen to my data? What does it say? What does it tell me? And then also, what do I think it might be saying that it's not saying? It is a corollary to that, okay? One side of the coin is, what does it tell me? At the same time, ask ourselves, okay, but what is that not saying that I'm falling into the trap of thinking that it is saying? Analyzing it to see what it's saying. There's a whole, this step right here, there's just so much in this. You could do so many different types of analysis. I happen to believe visualization is a huge part of it. I also believe statistics matters a lot here too. Summary statistics, getting into the world of data mining and algorithms. Sure, those types of analysis are hugely valuable. And oftentimes, again, the same thing happens here that happened before in the previous column there, the blue one, C, right? What we get to this point is that we start to do some analysis and we say, wait a second, there's an even better question. Oops, sorry, switch this. There we go. There's even another question here, right? So again, my analysis led me to a place where I said, I'm abandoning my first question. The scientific method is getting cut off about that original question. Maybe I'll come back to it, maybe I won't, okay? But either way, we're going into it and figuring out where we're at. Once we get this analysis, I think oftentimes what we're missing, and I've noticed that this is oftentimes missing, I've had conversations with people that haven't really used p-values in years. And I think that we need to ask ourselves, what's the practical significance of our finding? And then also, what's the statistical significance of it? If we're comparing two things, do we have enough data to be able to say with confidence that there's a difference between the two? That it's not just random chance that caused there to be some small difference, or even a large difference in the case of small n. We're in the world of big data, so there's oftentimes a large sample size that we're dealing with. But still, oftentimes when you start to get down to slicing and dicing and filtering your data down to subsets, you find yourself in scenarios where the sample sizes get smaller and smaller, and the comparisons you're making, may look significant, but they might not be. They might not be valid. So having some basic understanding of statistical hypothesis testing is important. And I know this is a really intimidating part of it for many people because, many of us took Stats 101 back in college. It wasn't always easy. So hopefully we find some ways along the road there to quickly and easily do confidence tests, things like t-tests, ANOVA, chi-squared, regression. Those ability that we can have to kind of just get an assessment of how statistically significant is our finding here. And then did that answer our question? That's the key. Then now we're at this beautiful place where we say okay, do I know something now, right? And if the answer is no, we're in this big loop back step where it's no, I didn't actually answer my question. And the question is then, well, why not? Right? Did you need more data? Did you not have enough data? Maybe there were issues with it that you need to actually go back and resolve, okay? And or, I'm still in this loop of trying to analyze it in a different way. And so this last box right here in the discover phase loops us back to everything. It loops us back to finding more data potentially. It loops us back to more cleaning and structuring. It loops us back to analysis. And this is where this process becomes iterative. And the more we can loop through and, kind of reiterate, and analyze and look at it in different ways very quickly, those types of people are able to make progress because of the speed involved with their analysis. Not to be hasty, but just to be able to be nimble and flexible and think about things in different ways and angles quickly and easily. To have at least a level of proficiency with some tools that are allowing us to do just that. And if we're super lucky and we did answer our question, then guess what? We get to move to this next step, which is a whole different discipline that so many people are realizing is critical, which is you most likely need to share this with other people, your colleagues, your coworkers, your customers or clients, just people in your sphere, your circle of connections, where you need to let them know about something. And so then the question is, okay, well, how do you craft and deliver a notable message? Notable in the sense that people pay attention to it, they extract meaning from it, they understand it. And this is a craft in and of itself. Actually, I think I've got, here we go. Storytelling with Data is a great book on this whole topic right here by Cole, Nussbaum, and Affleck. Highly recommend that one. Being able to tell an effective story is so important. Sometimes this step, there isn't a big group of people that you want to run this by. Maybe it's just something you were interested in. Maybe, it was just your own curiosity and it didn't really involve other people. Fair enough. I still think there's some value in sharing what you found. If it's meaningful to you, find someone in your circle of friends that you might want to, talk to them about that. Because this next step is super important too, which is that, when you're just in your own mind, you have certain questions and thoughts. And then kind of like BDSM versus WSDM, you tell it to somebody else and they see it from a whole different angle. And then, you didn't even predict that, and even maybe the people you did say, which I talked to them, said, oh no, I would never have guessed that. Point is, once your finding gets communicated outside of you and then it lands with someone else, they come back with something very interesting oftentimes. And the last step in this process is so important because then you need to say, what did you think about that? What occurred to you? What made sense? What was confusing? What do you think I missed? Where did it take you in your mind and the road you went down as you digested what it was that I was presenting to you? This is a two-way street now, right? And kind of realizing what happened there can take us to this next step, which is that maybe more questions arise. Maybe they say, yeah, but what about this? I hear what you're saying, but the thought occurred to me. And then they leave you with a whole other question, which takes you back down the same path of saying, yeah, okay, good point. I'm going to get more data to address that insight you have. Or I'm going to go back and do some additional analysis based on that caveat or concern you raised. And it's like, you're not done. You thought you were done. We thought we were across the goal line. Maybe not. Maybe we still have some ways to go. Okay. Questions arise when we interact with other people. New things pop out of this process here. It's a beautiful thing. I think we should embrace that. But if they say, hey, it's all good, and they're on board and they understand it, there were no objections, there were no major concerns or rework, if you want to call it that, then, great. Now we're into this really critical step of taking that information and doing something with it, enacting appropriate changes, deciding, taking a course of action. And then once we do that, we set more things in motion in our world around us, which enables us to go all the way back up and around here to the top and observe new things about the new reality that we put into place and into motion. And then we're back where we were, in that sense, we loop back. But again, hopefully it was a stair step up. It was to the place where now when we make our new observation, we're at a higher altitude, we're at a higher elevation, if you will. And that's a super exciting thing about this entire process, is that we are continuing to just mature, and sometimes it might feel like the opposite, like we make a discovery and we realize, well, we're not as far along as we thought we were. Maybe there are issues we didn't realize. But even that, in a sense, is true maturity, because even coming to a healthy and accurate appreciation of where you are now, even that in itself is maturing. So that is the flow chart in a nutshell. I want to talk to you about my dad. And I can talk about it in abstract flow chart form like that. And it's hard to really connect with it. So my dad, great guy that he passed away a couple of years ago, almost 4 years ago now, to brain cancer. And I was working with an organization here lately and happened to come across some really interesting data about brain cancer. And so, I want to kind of clarify the notion of incidence versus prevalence. And so they're two separate things, right? One would be incidence is when how many new cases are diagnosed in a given period of time. That's an incident rate, okay? Prevalence would be how many people at any given moment in time have that condition. So then that's like the amount of water that's in the bathtub, the number of people that are living with that condition in a moment in time. And then, the exit really is two separate exits. One would be someone passes away from a certain condition, and the other would be that they're cured of it. So they're no longer in the prevalence pool as someone who is living with it. Okay, so incidence, prevalence, and then death and cures are sort of this notion of studying from an epidemiological point of view how extensive a certain disease is. So brain cancer is something that, he had the same thing that John McCain had, glioblastoma. And so I thought a lot about it over the last few years. And like I said, I came across a data set here. So my observation was, this is a condition, and I saw firsthand what it does. And so my question was simply, well, how does the United States rank in terms of new cases of brain cancer in terms of other countries? As a country, as not in terms of the number of cases, but in terms of like the rate of cases, like per 10,000, per 100,000 people, I think oftentimes is how it's measured. So my observation was brain cancer is a thing that I'm interested in understanding more about. What's my question? How common is a diagnosis of brain cancer in the United States compared to other countries? My hypothesis is that the United States is in the top 5, okay? And that's based on some intuitive things I'm thinking about, like maybe we have more hospitals than some other countries that are less developed, so it'll be more commonly diagnosed. Maybe our lifespan is longer, so since cancer is a disease of the aging process, there's more people that might be likely to develop that condition than another country where perhaps people die at a younger age. Okay? So those are some of my kind of just gut take notions that the U.S. is going to rank in the top 5 in terms of the number of new cases diagnosed with brain cancer. So there's this cool tool that is put out by IHME. There's a link right there if you want to check it out yourself. And you can see I downloaded here all the countries and territories that had brain and nervous system cancers. You can see on the right there. Awesome tool they've got there. You click a button, and then what you get, a CSV like this. Okay, so now I've got my data. I didn't have to create it. I was able to go find it, and there it is. Right. So notice that it's got the country, and then actually breaks it down male or female, as well as all. And then, I can look at the number of cases, the percent of cases, the rate of cases. We can take a look at deaths, or as you can see if I scroll down even lower, incidence and prevalence. All 3 are in there. It's a really cool data set, very powerful data. And so, my first kind of like exploration of the contours was to kind of look at this and say, okay, how do I understand overall what's happening here? And actually, I need to bounce back to a slide that was out of order here. But what I found originally, where'd it go? Here it is that this is kind of like just my overall exploratory dashboard. Again, I just wanted to kind of see highest, lowest, things of that nature. But I noticed right away that the answer to my question, I kind of was able to get it pretty quickly, even just in the middle of exploring the contours, which is that in 2017 at least, the United States ranked 41st in terms of the incidence rate of cancer, 26.57. Again, I believe that's per 100,000 people are diagnosed with brain cancer in the United States. 41, not even in the top 40, which is very interesting to me. So in that sense, my question was answered. But what I ended up, and so you say like, okay, great, done. You kind of like jam through that loop process pretty darn quick, right? It's almost like shortcutted right to the end. But what I found was kind of even more interesting was I said, well, wait a second. The top 14 right here are all kind of Western European countries, many of them in North Europe, like Denmark and Iceland and Norway and Finland are all at the top right there in terms of, the highest incidence rate of brain cancer. So I was like, wow, that's interesting. So I kind of Googled it, what's going on with brain cancer in the Nordic countries, and wanted to kind of see, like, is there any research out there? This is an important point, actually. I went outside of the data to answer a different question, right? So in other words, spreadsheets, databases, CSVs, files, what have you, that's one form of data. There's another form of data, which is research findings, opinions, right? So in a sense, that's also information. And sometimes it doesn't involve the same tools. Maybe I just want to ask someone's point of view. I thought about reaching out to my father's doctor at UCLA and getting his take on it, what's going on. But I came across this article, brain cancer more common among highly educated. And there was actually a study done recently in 2016 about people in Sweden. That's why I came across this article, right? People in Sweden, okay, had a higher likelihood of developing brain cancer if they have a higher education. And I read this article, it was fascinating. But then I thought to myself, well, okay, I wonder though, I'm looking at country data for 195 countries. And I said to myself, well, how does the incidence of brain cancer compare with, for example, like education statistics? And luckily, the UN puts this human development data report out there every year, and they actually score countries on education, among many other things. One of them is like expected years of schooling. Maybe it's the mean number of years of schooling. There's an education index, right? So I kind of decided to use expected years of schooling as a starting point for all these same countries. Downloaded that spreadsheet. Awesome. I've got new data now to inform a different question, which is, what's the relationship between brain cancer incidence and education level? And I thought to myself, well, based on this article, okay, my hypothesis is that people with a higher level of education also have a higher, or I guess maybe more specifically, countries that have a higher overall level of education are also going to have a higher incidence rate of brain cancer. That's my hypothesis. And it's falsifiable because if it's not true, I can show that pretty quickly and easily, with data. And again, this is aggregated data, so very different than the detailed person-by-person analysis in the study in Sweden that we looked at. But in any case, again, a cursory view. So I was able to download it. Okay, there's my countries. Now notice this. One is from the UN, the other is from a totally different organization. So as you would expect, the countries weren't all identical. There was about 30 or so countries that have slightly different names. And there's even some overlap, right? So the first set of data around brain cancer had regions and territories like Taiwan, Puerto Rico, okay? Whereas the UN report was only countries, so Puerto Rico, or Guam, places like that would not be included and were not. So, but then oftentimes, right, the UN data, it's just spelled things differently. So there was some structuring, cleaning work that needed to be done to get to the place where I could bring these two data sets together, which I did. And so then you can see right here, here's a scatter plot of x-axis, right? Oftentimes you want to put what you consider to be the independent variable, the thing that you want to see how it changes, okay? And then the y-axis, the dependent variable, you're trying to understand how that correlates with the change in the x. So if you move over a certain distance on the x-axis, right, how high up does it go? And as you can see, gut check here is that, yeah, it does look like these countries over here to the right that have a higher overall number of expected years of schooling also are ones that have a higher incidence rate of brain cancer, brain and nervous system cancer. Okay, and we can even fit that with a curve, maybe a linear curve. This is an exponential curve, and we can play with that, right? To kind of understand things like the p-value. Is it statistically significant what we're seeing here? And then, how much of the variation is explained? That's a helpful coefficient of determination there. Also, as R squared helps us get a sense of how much of the variation in Y does variation in X explain, so to speak, right? So, but then I went even another further. I said, well, right now they're all simple little dots, but I would love it if I could then make the dot bigger for larger countries with more people in it. And, again, luckily enough, I can go download population data for all these countries, right? And I can make those circles like China, the United States, make those circles larger to show countries that have more people in them, which adds a new kind of layer to the analysis. And then I guess my point is you can just keep going from here, right? But again, a key thing to stop and look at is, especially remembering, we've all heard this phrase before, it's so important, right? That correlation does not imply causation. So going back to that process flow, right? What does it say and what does it not say? Well, what it doesn't say is that going to school gives you brain cancer, right? Like that's not what this data says. That would imply causation when, strictly speaking, we can only think about correlation. There could be other factors out there, like, for example, countries that have more expected years of schooling also have more doctors who are capable of diagnosing brain cancer and things of that nature. So there's many, many other factors going on here under the surface that could be involved. And so this doesn't tell us that. So in other words, don't worry, right? If you got your master's degree or beyond, That doesn't necessarily mean you're at a higher likelihood of cancer necessarily, right? Again, this is very aggregated data at the country level. So some caveats to that, but also kind of really kind of come clear with that with yourself. What are the things that this tells me? And what are the things it doesn't tell me? What are the limitations to the data? Okay, a couple of questions coming through here. Only a couple minutes left, so sorry, I spent most of the time here. Are you going to address prioritization of resources to build out this in an organization? Oh, I think we can talk about that down the road. That's a great idea. This whole idea of how does an organization take this and implement a highly data literate culture of continuous learning. Not today, but yeah, that's my next question is how do I take this flowchart, this methodology, fine tune it, start to work with organizations to implement it to raise data literacy. So I will have more thoughts on that down the road. Thanks, Eric. Great question. What tools, software do you use to clean your data, and what parameters do you recommend to consider? For cleaning data, for me, I try to keep out of the world of keying things in. So I love to use Tableau Prep. It's a new one. I also use OpenRefine as a great tool to help kind of identify issues and clean them as well. Those are a couple that I'm familiar with. I've been playing around with Trifacta a little bit. I got more to go on that, but you might want to check that out. They have a free version that you can play with and do some of these same kinds of data cleaning steps, joining things, identifying typos, identifying misspellings, identifying areas that may be in need of some adjustment and cleaning. So that's a great question as well. Yeah, so many great tools out there. OpenRefine is a free one that was put out there by Google. They spun it off. I think they picked it up again. So I'm not quite sure actually where OpenRefine is. Kind of felt to a lot of us for a while there like it was sort of like on the back burner and no one was looking into it. It seems lately some people have picked it up and are running with it and put some love into it. So check out OpenRefine. Tableau Prep, you need to have a Tableau creator license with that. And Trifacta, like I said, I think has a free version. People who use Alteryx love it, use it, swear by it. I've actually never used it, but that's definitely high up on my list of things I'd love to learn. I think it does this plus a whole lot more data modeling and whatnot. But yeah, certainly some of those cleaning steps are well within the capability set of Alteryx. Okay, Gustavo saying that exploratory is a great tool too. I'm glad you said that, Gustavo, because I've actually never heard of it, so I'm going to have to check that out. Exploratory. Huh? Would you mind putting a link in there, and then I'll send that out. Yeah, many more tools coming out every day, right? And we love that about what's happening right now. Is that think about the tools you've got now, and then try to remember. If you're like me, I went to college in the '90s. There was nothing like this, right? It's a golden era of tools. And I think, a big part of what I'm doing with this business is saying, okay, the tools are awesome. What's missing is culture. What's missing is literacy rather. What's missing is the ability to work with them and know how to use them, know how to not use them. Thank you, sir. Exploratory.io. Anybody wants to check that out. And it looks like it's built on R, which is awesome. Yeah, R and the Tidyverse have some really handy R for data science book by Hadley Wickham and one other collaborator whose name escapes me at the moment, but walks you through how to do some of these data munging steps directly in R. I know people who use Python do this kind of a thing too. So many tools, whether you're a coder, whether you prefer drag and drop, to avoid the kind of the cut and paste and copy paste. And that's just so error prone. I'm trying to really avoid. That's like a last step. And try to avoid that as much. Any other questions, guys? I'm so glad you guys are interested and have these interesting questions. What else? And also maybe in the last couple of minutes here, what did you think? Yeah, this will be available for viewing. It's being recorded, and I'm going to upload it to YouTube when I'm done here. And we'll also send out the link to the recording to everybody who's on here since I have your email addresses. So yeah, I'll make sure you get it. What did you guys think? Do you guys think a flowchart was good? Do you think it's over? I sometimes I accuse myself of over engineering things, but this is one where I guess I like it because I took some time to balance it, and I took some time to really organize it in a way that is symmetric. And so in that sense, I think there's some aesthetic value to it, but also just the flow is one that I looked at and I said, is this real? Is this really how it goes for me? And I think the answer is yeah. I definitely kind of kept, and since I made it, every time I mess with data, I kind of ask myself, is this true? And or like, am I missing something big in here? Yeah, it needs to be tested. I think it needs to be. So I'm going to continue to refine it. I imagine I'll change it. I had some great input from folks like Chantilly Jagannath. Really recommended switching the order of these two, the exploring its contours and considering its potential shortcomings. I had that the other way around, and she said, Ben, how are you supposed to think about shortcomings if you haven't even taken time to explore the contours? I said, great point, Chantilly. So I've been lucky to have some really great friends who have given me some feedback on this. Also, Anna Ford said, hey, you might want to kind of put the key there. So I actually, in the printout version, there's a key that shows what these shapes mean. A lot of people, we don't all deal with flowcharts day in and day out. So last thing I want to do is intimidate people with shapes. They may not even know what they mean. And so again, I've kind of made it clear what those shapes mean. So great. Like it. Need to test it. Me too. Glad you like this presentation and model, Christian. Will the model be available in PDF? Yeah, sure. I will do that. I'll create a PDF, send it out as a link here in the next following day as I send out the notes to the people on participation on here. So thanks again for joining. The Book of Why by Julia Pearl. No, I want to dive into that though. Thanks. I can get my reading list going here. And you're saying that it helps really with dealing with causation and correlation. Cool. I'll check that out. The Book of Why. How about aligning this chart to skill sets at each level? I need to give some thought, Gustavo. Why don't you email me more your thoughts about that and talk about what type of alignment you're thinking about there. I think it's good to know, again, my philosophy right now is really we need people to be at level one of this whole flow, right? It doesn't matter if you're a data engineer and you spend all your time making databases. It doesn't matter if you're a data storyteller and all you do is take the finished analysis and make something amazing for people to understand and a TED talk or whatever, right? Like we all need to kind of be generally literate in every single one of these steps and to know what they're about. If you're collecting data, where is it going? Where is it being stored? That matters. How do you collect it? How is it being collected? Those things matter. If you don't really have a general understanding of those things, then you miss the boat, right? You kind of are not familiar and you don't know what questions to ask. You don't know what pitfalls to avoid. And you run down on your little lane here. It's kind of like specialty would be maybe in each one of these lanes, maybe. And then if you're not kind of, again, at least somewhat versed in what the other lanes are all about and how to do them and how someone who's an expert in them thinks about going about it. And then again, being able to do that kind of like initial go down the slope on a snowboard. So you kind of know both edges. You kind of having that flexibility that sort of, we don't all need to be a jack of all trades, but there is something to be said about being generally literate about every little piece of the puzzle here. I think is really important. This would be interesting Vanessa says, to share at something like a staff meeting to non-data people. Yeah, my guess is a lot of people on the call here, since my network is full of amazingly talented data people, I'm guessing many of you are also data people. So I'm getting the point of view of people saying, does this match what I do day in and day out? Which I think is super valuable as well. And that's where, again, I've gotten a lot of great feedback at the beginning. But yes, absolutely. I intend to take this to non-data people. I've run it by a few in my own kind of personal circle and got their take on it. But yeah, really my goal is now to take this and work with people in workshops with this exact flow and take their data and go through it. Not my training data, not something about brain cancer or something that matters a lot to me. Something that matters a lot to them. And they've got some raw data with a question. That's it. Bring that to me. We'll work through it. That's kind of my next goal here, is setting up some workshops to be able to do that. So look for more information on that soon. We're over time. You all probably have meetings to go to and run off to. I wish you a wonderful afternoon, wherever in the world you are. Thank you for participation. Thank you for your thoughts and comments and questions. Super helpful for me. And again, look for an email with the link to the recording. Feel free to share it to anyone. And like I said, I'll also make a PDF for you all that you can print out and maybe share with your colleagues too. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. Everybody have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.